The price of games has been a contentious issue for quite some time, but it is a conversation mired in false equivalences. While it is true that over the course of this console generation we've seen a not insignificant rise in the average cost of big budget games, the reality is that on the whole, games are actually cheaper than they've ever been, and the scope of pricing is so wide now that there is something for all budgets out there. Unfortunately, and with a healthy dose of FOMO lurking around every corner, all eyes are inevitably drawn to the pricier end of this scale whenever we talk about this. As we have these conversations about the cost of the biggest of these monolithic offerings, their eyes eclipsing our stomachs, and how much impetus is put on the consumer to help them break even, we shouldn't forget that there is a much larger population of creators that often struggle to simply continue existing. Not just indie, but the indie of indie. The little guy, the quintessential starving artist putting themselves out there at the mercy of the buying public. It's no coincidence the number of great games out there made by a team that never got to work on a follow-up. A phenomenon stemming from the seemingly impossible task of making ends meet from your labour of love. For every indie powerhouse we see celebrated, there are 1,000 more who just didn't make the cut, and that's, well, it's very sad, isn't it? I think part of the problem is the unfair notion of what is and isn't too much to pay for a game. Yes, we all agree that a £70 price tag is particularly eye-watering, but I know we also have these unspoken thresholds for what we individually consider the right amount for any given work. It has no foundation in economics, but rather the bizarre tapestry of desire and logic that makes up our buying habits. Not to mention a decades-long flash sales culture devaluing our understanding of what certain types of games should cost, although that's a conversation for another day. The purchasing power of whatever currency you operate in is not equal across the board, not for you, nor for the creators who benefit from your patronage. What might not even make a dent in a quarterly report for one group might end up being a life-changing boon for another. For the consumer, there's the choice of a significant gamble on whether you will enjoy one specific expensive purchase for the foreseeable future, or an incredibly emancipating realm of options, a myriad of hidden gems just waiting to be plucked from obscurity. This is what has led me to a question and the basis for this video. How much can you get for the same price or less than a single new AAA release? Over the winter break, and with the intent of showing you how much good, inexpensive stuff is out there, I discovered and purchased 12 games that all came to a total of a full tenner less than the recommended retail price of Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Having now played all 12 titles, let me tell you all about them. And I hope in doing so I will convince you that it's absolutely worth taking the plunge on unknown quantities in this way. Let's start light, with the impossible task of talking about something without talking about it. I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler light as possible, but given that this game can be completed in a half hour or less, and the big aha moment normally happens within minutes of starting, it's going to be a challenge. You're in an underground passage, the kind you'd see in tube stations all across the globe. Stark lighting, aseptic tiles, mundane posters for indistinguishable services and events, more cameras than you would think necessary. You're just there to get out of there, but this passage keeps zigzagging, none of the signs seem to point to the exit you want, and strange things are happening all around you. The Exit 8 is one of those games you really need to go into blind, and in explaining the setup I've probably already said too much. Knowing what it is and how it works runs the risk of dispelling the illusion, but at least let me try to explain in a roundabout, abstract way why I think it's worth your time. Sometimes an idea is too good to be stretched out beyond its natural reach. A creator will look at something established and popular and figure out how to strip all the bullshit out of it and bring it down to its rawest and most pure state, aesthetically and tonally existing somewhere between proof of concept and student project, and I mean that in a non-derogatory sense. This is what the Exit 8 is to me. A player-driven interaction in its most primal form, using its simplicity to elevate its world and its perils, so that by the time you figure out what's going on and what you need to do to reach the credits, you are rewarded with a precise and perfectly paced experience. There's an incredible attention to detail present that you simply would not get from a less confident game, and that attention to detail is key to making this whole thing work. The ordinariness of the space, the stock asset aesthetic, seems put in place specifically to trip you up and make you look a lot closer at, well, everything. It's a specific mundanity. The Exit 8 really excels at being misleadingly simple like this. The beauty of its design comes from utilizing the repetition of its setting and your expectations of what you're supposed to be looking for to pull the rug from under you. It's an illusion. An ocean the size of a stamp, a tapestry weaving human experience and dream logic together to create something powerfully nightmarish. Not really in a traditional horror sense, but in that increasingly popular and very misattributed subgenre of liminality. The world is not what you think it is. It does not operate by the same rules you assumed to govern all, and that in itself grants the potential for great distress. Is the Exit 8 good? Who knows? I've not seen any counter-criticism about it, not that I've seen much criticism at all. The reason I know about it in the first place was because a number of very specific folk online whose tastes I intrinsically and haphazardly trust were saying, "Play this, don't read anything about it." It's not that I have doubts about the experience, but I just don't know if it will work for everyone. Was it a fascinating experience for me personally? Absolutely. Is it worth 3 of your hard-earned pounds? I don't know, who gives a shit? A coffee costs that much and can be a far shorter and far more bitter experience. Take the leap. And speaking of leaps... If you're anything like me, your first few runs of Mosa Lina will likely annoy you. It's a baffling game, really. The goals seem so rudimentary, yet your arsenal, your tools to achieve them are pathetic and wanting. Each level has 2 pieces of fruit you have to touch and an exit portal to return to. How you go about it will depend on what abilities you've been gifted for that particular run. And these are not things that you would traditionally associate with a game like this. Okay, you've got a gun that fires out fish. Cool. Now what? Oh, you can spawn a ladder just in front of you, but you can't climb up its rungs. Great, okay, fine. It's almost nonsensical in its design at first because, again, if you're anything like me, you will not be able to complete a single level. It will feel slapdash to you. Bullshit. Bad game design. Another entry alongside Quap and Getting Over It and Cat Mario in the eternal vault of rage-baiting troll games. So why could I not put it down? Mosa Lina is a game you inevitably end up sinking hours into because it so cleverly draws you in. Every now and then you'll get a cool gadget, or you'll discover through strange happenstance that your objectives can be achieved by other means. It's a piece of design that I don't believe is inherently hostile to the player. The messaging of the game itself is that not every level can be completed. It never punishes you for not being able to do it the first time, second time, or even a dozen times. While your arsenal is random, a triptych of daft shit that you have to figure out the best use for, the levels themselves are bespoke and built to be solved in more than one way. Spend enough time with them and you start to realize, oh, this is actually a lot of fun. Mosa Lina markets itself as a hostile interpretation of the immersive sim, and really I think that is key to understanding its value as a gaming experience. Every failed attempt begs further questions. Every confusing ability hides an answer to its purpose somewhere. The world is tangible. Its dangers have a very physical presence. Every action creates a ripple effect that more often than not screws you over, but failure can often be all the more entertaining. If anything, it shares a lot in common with Spelunky, where the world is not interested in catering to your whims, instead acting as an arc for great abstract environmental storytelling. When you do eventually succeed, and trust me, you will, victory is all the sweeter for the fable you built along the way. It's brash, and hilarious, and oh so terribly strange. Its creator, Stuffed Wombat, has built a fascinating playground of oddities here. One could easily get lost in it for hours, a place where friction is an intrinsic part of the process. Creating what is essentially a puzzle game with no fixed solution might seem ridiculous on paper, but it allows the game to be more than just the sum of its parts. Something we will explore to a far more minimalist and obfuscated degree in this next title. Of all the games on this list, Sethian is going to be the hardest to talk about, mainly because I think I might just be too stupid to pass what it wants of me. I'm no stranger to not getting puzzle games. Especially in recent years, there have been many a title that have left me completely baffled. You have your witnesses and Steven Sausage Rolls and Baba Azuz of the world offering an extremely grey matter stretching experience. Meanwhile, I like simple stuff, like last year's Cocoon, puzzle games that make you feel smart rather than force you to be smart. No shade on Cocoon intended, I thought that game was great, it's just an extremely polished linear experience for dummies like me. I bought Sethian because I saw it compared to the likes of Heaven's Vault and Chants of Sennaar, games that hold language decipherment at their heart and puzzles I generally got on with quite well. This, well, just look at it. Where do you even start? The premise of the game is that you are an explorer on another planet, one bereft of life, bereft of civilization, all bar a computer monitor with a completely alien interface. In your notebook you have assembled a basic understanding of what buttons serve what functions, but as for the keyboard layout, well, that is the game. Sethian is about language in its most raw and frightening state, a game where you have to decipher an entire script in a world devoid of contextual clues. Where Chants of Sennaar had action and reaction as the cornerstones of its linguistic investigation, and Heaven's Vault had the subjective musings of its protagonist to guide you, Sethian has nothing. Well, it has a basic understanding of grammatical structure and the meaning of 3 symbols. Not much of a Rosetta Stone now, is it? I think it's important to understand when approaching games like this that when I say I kind of hate it, this is not a value judgment about the game itself, but rather my own ego. I don't like to feel stupid, and in this instance, where I have not been able to overcome even the first obstacle, it makes me feel bad. But it's also an experience that has made me not want to scour the internet for hints as to where to start. That, to me, feels like it would make for an infinitely worse experience than the one I'm already having. That's the power of a good puzzle game, I think. Sethian is brutal, harsher and less forgiving than anything I've ever played, but in that uncompromising design I have found a wholly singular experience that, despite my frustrations, I can only describe as masterful. I may not get anywhere with it anytime soon, but it's shown me what games can be, and for just £4, maybe you can see it too. Right, that's enough challenging the walnut-sized mass of neurons rattling around my skull for now. Time to take it down a notch. Time for something a bit more relaxing. I could have populated this entire list with Sock Pop Collective games, since the vast majority of their catalogue retails for under a £5. They're a great little artistic enclave, predominantly supported by crowdfunding through Patreon, that specialises in releasing monthly, bite-sized, funky little adventures that are very cute and infinitely charming. Frog's Adventure is no different, a great little point-and-click adventure game that doesn't do anything groundbreaking really, but everything it does do, it executes really well. You are a frog who has been somewhat anthropomorphized by a rogue fairy, and with your newfound humanity, you seek to hunt that son of a bitch down and make them change you back. To do so, you must navigate a world of other changed creatures, solving their conundrums and unlocking navigation options, recruiting allies along the way. It's basically Mass Effect 2, but cuter. I honestly don't have much to say about this game on a mechanical level. It's really good, you should play it for yourself, but where I think it truly sings is in how it marries its visuals, animation and audio. It has these lovely little flourishes. Bumps and hums and blips as you hop on lily pads and rustle through grass, and the crunchy sound of opening doors is all just so delicious. There's something in the execution of this particular style that makes you feel as though you are navigating a physical, tangible space. One thing stuck out for me in particular was how the gate opening animation isn't really an animation. This asset is treated as a physics object, one of very few present in the game, but it lends an incredible weight to the world that just sucks you in further. It's the perfect length for a game like this, something you can rattle through in a few hours with optional stuff to unlock, achievements that encourage revisiting how you approached navigating its puzzles. It's not too challenging, the characters are very cute, the backstory has terrifying philosophical implications, a perfect chilled out pit stop on this journey of intrigue. Now let's talk about something completely different. This might be my favourite of the whole bunch. My first thought going into Beton Brutal was, ah, cool, a climbing game without any hand-holding. My second, third, fourth and fifth thoughts were all variations of not very family-friendly words. You fall off stuff a lot when you first play this game. As you're figuring out the scope of your ability to jump and climb, there inevitably rests a period where you will end up retrying the same sections over and over. I certainly did. This continued for quite some time, and then I figured out how to do a long jump, and it made the game a fraction of a tad easier. Then I started getting the hang of things, more accurately judging the distance between spaces, enacting ape-brained pattern recognition to sail through earlier bits of this hostile geometry, and I started scaling the heights of this weird, dank, abandoned building to a magnificent degree, and oh, for Christ's sake! Beton Brutal is a love letter to the people who didn't hate the Zen platforming sections in Half-Life. Those magnificent suckers for punishment who inevitably got rewarded for their perseverance. It's a game about climbing much in the vein of something like Jump King, where a single mistimed bound can land you right back at the start. The Dark Souls of jumping puzzles. A newbie's nightmare and a speedrunner's wet dream. It's a game that has both airtight design and impeccable vibes. I want to live here, in amongst the rust and the damp. I want to see how quickly I can ascend to whatever lies above. I know I can do it, because the game has shown me from minute one how quickly I became familiar with the weight of my own body and how it exists in conversation with the environment. The Dark Souls comparison may seem flippant, but I honestly feel like it's a better game for comparison than that series usually gets lumbered with. You will find yourself developing a relationship with this world over the course of its many repetitions, each sequence of jumps in turn becoming more like a self-contained level and a living portrait of progress. What used to take 10 minutes to clear will eventually only take seconds. You'll be able to get higher and higher with greater regularity with each run. You'll realise that despite how punishing it may seem, the game really is working with you to succeed, and the only times it starts to get more difficult is when you, the player, start to get flustered. It's incredible. Of all the games on this list, I think it might be the coolest. I can't believe it's only a $5. Pony Island is a game that fits neatly into a brilliant but astringent genre of games designed to mess with your expectations, games like Frog Fractions and Doki Doki Literature Club. Its creator, Daniel Mullins, would go on to make Inscription, which I made a video about a few years back, and a recently announced sequel has thrown this back into the zeitgeist, if only for a moment. What I'm trying to say is that this is probably the game on this list I was most aware of going into. At some level, I knew there were going to be some expectations severely subverted, so this is not really virgin territory like the other entries on this list. However, the act of knowing about it and playing it are two very different experiences. I love games where you get to bugger about in menus. It's a level of immersion that feels so intimate, where the events of the story are happening to you personally, changing parameters, unlocking secrets, tripping up your expectations of what a game is going to be. And this is what Pony Island is, a game masquerading as another game. The titular island warps and evolves over the course of the experience, a sort of modular design Mullins is famous for, one that, by his own admission, comes from a place of getting easily bored more than any formal intentionality. The only downside here is that having played this now so far from its original release, I've gone in having already spent time with the games it inspired, and the ones that no doubt inspired it. An experience like this inevitably ends up losing steam by virtue of the environment it is played in, and especially having come to this quite soon after playing One Shot, a brilliant little adventure game that does all this trickery with gusto, and something that predates Pony Island by several years, I feel bad for not being more enthusiastic about what it's attempting to do. Beyond the daft story and meta elements of the gameplay, this is a game about how we make games. The process of iteration, the frustration of player versus authorial intent, the all-consuming agony of having to make the choice to kill your darlings. Every work of art is built upon a graveyard of abandoned prototypes, laid bare and at the mercy of the minds of others. It's an incredibly compelling experience. Of course that was then, but what's been going on in the 8 years since its original release? Having finally played Pony Island, I now feel like I have a greater appreciation for what does and doesn't work within this genre framework. While Mullins is the indisputable champion of this realm, he's not the only one on the block. And this recently released puzzle game offers an interesting take on similar tricks. The framing here is gorgeous, first of all. A lo-fi operating system that is home to a load of chunky applications, extremely satisfying clicky bits, and, like all good computers, a demonic presence. Very quickly, you install a classic 3D maze that becomes the hub for all of your investigations, and what follows is a great little game that plays around with its general means of interaction. It's very tactile and playful with it. Alongside navigating the maze and solving its puzzles, you will find levers to pull, patterns to memorize. At one point, a physics model of a dead horse you can fling around the screen. No, that's not a joke. And unfortunately, the whole thing does not quite have the same wow factor I got from other similar titles. I think as a mechanical experience, I do prefer it to Pony Island, and I think its presentation does a lot to persuade you to keep playing. The puzzles themselves are really nice, chunky things with elements that feel physical and temporal, different ideas melding together rather nicely. Every new area unlocked adds another piece type to the roster, so by the end you're juggling a good half-dozen different ideas, but it's always clear what you have to achieve without being too handholdy about it. Taking it as a pure puzzle game, I think it's really great. As another game that operates on multiple layers with an operating system as a metatextual framework, however, I've seen this idea executed one too many times now, and in my eyes this, and in fairness Pony Island too, don't quite do it for me. Part of the problem is, again, that One Shot, in my humble opinion, does all this better. Comparisons suck. Obviously, it's not Crossroad OS's fault that Future Cat made something incredible a full decade ago, but in this case there's always going to be diminishing returns on that mind-melting wow factor that a lot of interactive experiences rely on. I think also that what is attempted here at a meta level doesn't quite work anyway. It's not very well communicated and relies a bit too much on traditional point-and-click, try-it-and-see game logic to get to its conclusion. There's also a noticeable lack of a compelling narrative pushing you into the niches of the game's structure like there is in those other games I mentioned. The setup is similar, you're essentially tasked with exorcising demons in this digital realm, but I did not get that same immersive sense of personal peril as in Pony Island, nor a protagonist to root for a la One Shot. Luckily here, the meat and potatoes of this game is good enough to stand on its own. The puzzles themselves really are great, and it is absolutely baffling to me that this is only £4. Could have charged double that and still felt like a steal. I feel bad for not having much to say about Otok, because it's not a bad game by any stretch. Another entry in the low-stakes, no-goals town builder genre popularised by games like Townscaper. The goal is to use the tiles available to you to make something nice in the space provided. No constraints, no scoring system, build a community, then move on. I sort of respect the simplicity of it, really. While the various trees, rocks and buildings don't quite snap together as well as Townscaper's malleable modular design, or the incredibly Moorish jigsaw elements of something like Dwarf Romantic, I don't think that's the point of its design at all. This is probably a huge and very pretentious stretch, but Otok to me feels like a game about how communities form organically, not the huge planned cities of the modern era, but in this meandering, somewhat chaotic manner, where you build around what's already there. Where I hesitate in this reading, however, is that each island is set up as a blank slate to begin with, devoid of features of community or indigenous life. The theme works topographically, but socially, systemically, politically, I'm not so sure. Having grown up in a rural community, this is the sort of world I always knew, for better or worse, where spaces wrapped themselves around that which existed before and you get a visceral sense of history even at a glance. In the case of Otok, however, there is no space that existed before, not even the assuage of nature. It's an artificiality that feels very weird until you start placing these elements back into that space. When I published my video on Terra Nil last year, one of the key points I inferred is that all art is inherently political, whether its creators intend it to be or not. Even in the selection of a genre indicator we have implications galore. Otok calling itself a city builder in its Steam description, even if it is a chill one with no goals, is a statement. What I neglected to properly explore in that video, however, is that it's up to an audience to decide how much they want to engage with that political empty space. Part of me wonders if my own sensibilities are the problem here. As a political science graduate, as a healthcare worker, as someone deeply disturbed by the unchallenged continuation of settler colonial violence across the globe, I worry that I'm doing the art I engage with a disservice by implying a mission where there might not be any. Can any city builder just be that? I don't feel this unease about Townscaper or Dorfromantik, because to a degree they have abstracted themselves from reality. They are essentially 3D objects being rotated in a person's mind. So I suppose the question ends up being whether the inclusion of a landmass to begin with really changes the intent and message of a game like this. For such a low entry fee, I think Otok is a pretty good one of these, and I've appreciated the mental break it's given me by refusing to give me tasks to do or think about the placement of those tiles beyond taste-driven aesthetics. There's still stuff to engage with here, even if you aren't the victim of a self-inflicted brain poison like me. Have a go, let me know what you think. Oh Christ, where to even start with this one? A low poly sim where you play as a spider thief. Incredibly cool concept. Wild execution. Kinda janky, kind of evocative, a fiddly and precise experience that I really need to spend more time with. The big source of inspiration here is the Thief series, both in terms of mechanics and just general vibe. This is a challenging game. Taking your foes head on will most likely result in death, and the valuable lesson here is that movement and verticality are your friends. You are a thief, a scout, a creature of incredible athleticism, but with a constitution not unlike a paper doll. You must use every possible advantage you can muster to navigate these hostile realms. To be honest, outside of Sethian, this is the game on this list that I had the most trouble with. Its controls are incredibly fiddly, you race around at 1,000,000 miles an hour, making it hard at times to be precise. Picking up stuff is weirdly complicated. You have to have a free hand to do so, and then the item has to be manually stored on a different hotkey each time to free your hand again. I guess it's a consequence of being so used to that kind of thing being automatic in modern games that it's a little jarring to see a return to tradition again. I don't know if it would really lose anything were this to be smoothed out, but that's not really up to me, is it? Equally jarring is realizing that while this is predominantly a stealth game, the world is not really set up to cater to your needs. Enemies spot you with relative ease, although this is mitigated by them losing interest the moment they lose line of sight. It's hard to get the drop a lot of the time because of how levels are laid out, and as you can see in this footage, tackling your foes head on is not a good idea. It would be incredibly cheap of me to consider these faults of the game rather than faults in my own playstyle. By my own admission, I just haven't spent enough time in this game to properly get to grips with its strengths. And there are things I really like about it too. The crouch slide, for example, a must-have for any first-person experiences toolkit, is very satisfying here. It's visually stunning too, part retro throwback, part doing its own thing, big crunchy textures and a great soundscape, little animated flourishes here and there capturing a sense of magic in the air. The layout of the world is fascinating, taking advantage of your prehensile limb to climb and jump and dive to your heart's content. And even though it's not really set up to your advantage, it's still a funky space to navigate that couples a sense of the architectural coherence of modern sims like Dishonored with more abstract sensibilities found in older games. There's this really cool idea where periodically throughout a level you'll find a burrow to a merchant. Multiple inconsistent entrances to a single area is a really magical effect that does wonders for world building, layering the Euclidean on top of and around the non-Euclidean. I like this a lot. This is a game I think I'm going to have to keep plucking away at. It has an incredible sense of depth and quality for something so relatively inexpensive. The only real investment you need is time and patience. And spatial awareness, you'll need buckets of that. And the same is true of this next game, which really tests your ability to read your environment. One of the things that a lot of retro throwbacks avoid doing is properly emulating all the restraints of the technology of that era. Why would you? The benefit of modern computing is that we can now evoke the tone and atmosphere of eras long past, but now with smoother frame rates and a more pleasant fidelity, giving us the scope and textures that we thought the games we played in the past had, but didn't really. So, Pseudo Regalia doesn't do this. This is a whole new N64 game through and through. Muddy textures, fuzzy definition, limited frame rate, but some of the nicest feeling platforming controls I've experienced in quite a while. It's a strange game to be sure. Its world is meandering and seemingly imprecise, an abstract mass of floating platforms and biblically accurate horrors, but it does this great thing of tying progress not to defined abilities necessarily, but rather adjuncts to your moveset that you have to figure out how to use to progress. As you start out, that moveset is limited until you start to uncover core abilities of varying degrees of obfuscation. Things at first are obvious, like a tactical slide to get under small gaps and a slam jump that lets you get to higher areas, but most of the navigation challenges in the game can't really be completed using these abilities in isolation. They require more than just pinning one move to one obstacle. The result is a kind of fascinating puzzle game within its moveset that expands and gets more intricate the more abilities you discover, and you start to realise that Pseudo Regalia approaches platforming the way a character action game does its high-end combat, only in this case you can't get by with simple button mashing. It's not perfect. I found navigation a bit difficult to pass. Very early on you have access to quite a range of spaces where it's not obvious when you just can't progress with your current moveset. Because of how the game is designed, you don't get a lot of environmental guidance on what route you have to take. You can sort of fudge a lot of the platforming with a little luck and good timing, and be rewarded with a fresh set of dead ends. I found myself revisiting spaces a number of times before finally figuring out where the next piece of this kinetic jigsaw was, and that may turn off a fair few folk. However, I think for something that is the work of a single dev and available for less than a $5, it's a remarkable effort that is at least worth investigating for the vibes alone. And speaking of vibes, I've previously talked about another of Antonio Freya's games, It Comes in Waves. He's a developer who seems to thrive on these incredible apocalyptic mood pieces with unbelievably cool names. Stripped down, bare bones, PS1-esque experiences that are more interested in player-directed storytelling than having their worlds explicitly tell you what's going on. No Sun to Worship is a stealth game, and a particularly brutal one at that. Each mission has you seek out and punish a series of targets before making your way to an exit. The tools at your disposal are limited, a couple of firearms with not much ammunition, an ability to quieten your footsteps at the cost of your health. There is no radar, barely anything in the way of a user interface. Levels are populated by extremely uncompromising guards who will take you down within seconds if you're not quick on your feet. Success is fleeting. Failure is lethal. This is not a pleasant experience, and it's not meant to be. Everything from the character movement to the setting to the presentation of your targets, restrained, bagged and clad in orange jumpsuits, is designed to make you feel sweaty, nauseated, alone. I feel like on an aesthetic level this is one of the most impressive games I've played in a long time, and a showcase of just how far we've come with technology, that what would have been best in show on previous generations is now achievable by a few people with relatively short development window. This came out in September last year. By the time this video is published, Freya will have another game out. Man's a demon. No Sun to Worship will certainly have limited appeal. It's uncompromising in its vision and unforgiving in its gameplay. You don't have a lot of options if things go south, and the whole thing has an unbelievably nihilistic vibe that is incredible but draining. It's a bad hang in the best possible way. I don't know if I like it, and that's perhaps the highest praise you can give a game like this. I really can't stand snow levels in games. I find them so boring. The colour palette always seems to be the same, and beyond anything else they rarely convey the true sensation of being in that environment. The drudgery of moving through inches of snow, the precariousness of navigating icy surfaces, the howling wind, the piercing, torturous cold. As I write this section, we were in the middle of a frosty snap here in the UK, and I really picked the worst possible time to play this entry, but I'm really glad I did, because that which gave chase is, well, bloody brilliant. Navigating an impossible, vast and indiscriminate Arctic climate with little more than your wits, an eerie companion, and a sled pulled by 4 heckin' doggos, yes you can pet them, That Which Gave Chase is an intensely cinematic game. Not in the bombastic AAA blockbuster sense, but in that hyper-stylized, tightly edited way you see in modern filmmaking. It's A24 horror. You've probably seen this style of snapcut in games like Virginia and Paratropic, but here it feels way more pronounced. The shock of transforming the landscape from blinding whites to deep navy blues is incredibly evocative, but also a really clever technical feat. Not only does it keep the pace of the experience, it also does a lot to convey the passage of time and distance in a way a lot of games don't. Coupled with the strange, fuzzy visual fidelity and the fact that a lot of the experience deals with the idea of snow blindness, getting lost in a space so impossibly vast that there often aren't even any visible landmarks to orient yourself against, and you have a game that captures the essence of something far grander than it actually is. Moment to moment, it echoes this tense sensation of abandonment through your skull as you traverse an ocean of white, attempting to discover how anything is able to live out here, and in turn uncovering something wicked at the burning heart of this frosted wasteland. While some of the set pieces unveil the limitation of the game's controls, That Which Gave Chase is a mostly flawless execution of a very good idea. So much so that my only real gripe is that the dialogue is often quite hard to read, and that's specifically to do with the placement of the text. Despite how limited the actual gameplay is, it's still quite an involved game. You have to make sure you're orienting your sled so that you don't biff it, ensuring you're pointing in the right direction, and reading what little of the landscape is salient to progress to the next scene, and so I was constantly having to choose between reading and navigating in a way that I think doesn't really do either facet justice. I appreciate that voice work might not have gelled with the artistic vision or simply wasn't in the budget, so maybe something as simple as shifting the text to center screen and a slightly more forgiving font might have helped a lot with this issue, but even without it, this is a minor frustration in an otherwise incredibly immersive game. Start to finish, That Which Gave Chase takes a little under 90 minutes. Given the filmic quality of it, that makes perfect sense. Its story is vague and biting. Echoes of cosmic horror flitter throughout, bouncing off the trees and the blankets of white. A whole world contained within the sleeves of a celluloid dream, with an unbelievably tense, nail-biting and violent conclusion. As the final entry on this list, I think it's an absolute banger. "12 games. 12 bespoke experiences by extremely small dev teams with an even smaller cost of entry. Considering the almost random selection that led to this list, I'm amazed that there wasn't a single duffer among them, even if I wasn't completely in love with every single one. It goes to show the level of quality in the indie scene these days, that you can take an almost complete stab in the dark and still find something that stays with you long after you finish it. It's almost disgusting how much of this falls into obscurity, but it would take a lifetime to give everything its rightful attention. There are dozens of things like this released every single day, thousands upon thousands vying for your attention all year round. You have to pick your battles. But if you were to take one thing away from this video, it's this. From time to time, spend what money you have unwisely. Take the plunge on small, weird-looking unknowns, even if you're still grabbing hold the reins of big-budget trends alongside them. There's so much cool shit out there. And if we're to continue having such a vibrant and varied medium, we need to start supporting these little guys, these indie of indies, these starving artists much, much more. And for God's sake, pay full price if you can. Half of the games on this list are severely undervaluing themselves. I would have gladly paid a tenner or more for many, if not all of them. I know it's not a solution to the worsening state of games today, where financial success doesn't even equate well-being for the people who make the things we enjoy. I know we ultimately need to burn the whole system to the ground and build something new, but even for a minute, if we can somehow allow a few folk their time in the sun, maybe we can grow something small and significant there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please leave a comment below. I had a great time producing this, and I'm enjoying pushing myself to try new things on a whim. My Steam wishlist currently has 107 games on it, many of which fit into this same budgetary criteria, so I definitely have material for a second volume. Plus, there's a whole roster of games out there that retail for not next to nothing, but quite literally nothing, that I really want to check out. Artists and game makers are so generous with their work these days. See you next time.